Two weeping girls at his ex-wife's grave. Millionaire couldn't believe who they were. Michael Carter walked slowly through the iron gates of the cemetery, his polished shoes clicking faintly against the stone path. The late autumn sky hung low with streaks of grey and fading orange, the sun sinking behind the trees. In his hand, he carried a bouquet of roses wrapped neatly in white paper. The roses were fresh, red as blood, their fragrance rising in the cool evening air. Emily had always loved roses, though she used to laugh and say wildflowers felt more alive. He remembered her voice clearly, teasing him about spending too much money on store-bought flowers. Now, those memories pressed heavily on him, each one like a stone added to his chest. The wind stirred gently, carrying the faint rustle of fallen leaves across the path. Michael adjusted the collar of his suit, though the chill he felt wasn't from the weather. It had been years since he last stood here, years of excuses and silence. Work had always been his reason, but deep down he knew it was guilt that kept him away. He had built an empire, wealth beyond imagination, yet none of it filled the void Emily left. The gravel crunched under his shoes as he approached the familiar row of headstones. His steps grew slower the closer he came, as though unseen hands pulled him back. But he pressed on, determined at last to face what he had long avoided. The headstone came into view, simple and clean, standing quietly among the others. Michael stopped, his throat tightening as his eyes fell upon the name engraved in stone. Emily Carter. The letters seemed to cut into him more deeply than any wound. He swallowed hard, fighting the sting that burned his eyes. She had once been his everything, his partner, his friend, his anchor in a storm. Yet he had let ambition and pride push her away until there was nothing left to hold. Kneeling slowly, he placed the roses at the base of the grave. The petals brushed lightly against the marble, as though offering their own silent apology. His fingers lingered on the stone, cold and unyielding beneath his touch. Memories of Emily's warm hands flooded his mind, the way she used to hold him tightly. The contrast between past warmth and present coldness pierced through him. He bowed his head, voice trembling as he finally spoke the words locked inside. "Forgive me, Emily," he whispered. The sound was barely louder than the breeze, yet it carried every ounce of his sorrow. He closed his eyes, hoping foolishly that somehow she could hear him. The silence that followed was heavy, pressing in from all sides. It was the kind of silence that made a man feel completely alone. Michael exhaled slowly, the breath shaky, uneven, burdened with years of regret. For a moment, the world around him seemed to stand still. He thought of the laughter they once shared, the home they had built together. He thought of the arguments, the distance, the way success had replaced love. Regret gnawed at him, sharper now than ever before. He wished he had chosen differently, spoken kinder words, stayed longer nights. But wishes were powerless in the face of a grave. All he had left now were apologies, whispered to the wind. He brushed a speck of dust from the gravestone, a small, tender gesture. It felt like the only care he could offer her now. His knees ached from kneeling, but he refused to move. He wanted to linger, to hold on to this fragile connection a little longer. A bird called in the distance, its cry echoing through the trees. The branches swayed gently overhead, their shadows stretching across the ground. Michael let out a sigh, heavy and tired, as if releasing years of weight. But as his sigh faded, another sound crept into the silence. At first he thought it was the wind shifting through the leaves. He tilted his head, listening closely, uncertain. Then he heard it again, a faint muffled sound, soft yet piercing. It was not the wind. It was not the call of a bird. It was something else entirely. a sound raw and human. Crying. Michael's body stiffened, his breath catching in his throat. The sound was quiet, but unmistakable. It was the kind of sobbing one tries to hold back, hidden and broken. He turned his head slightly, scanning the rows of graves. The sound came again, clearer now, trembling with sorrow. Michael's pulse quickened, his heart pounding against his ribs. The cemetery was nearly empty. He had seen no one when he entered. Yet here, in the stillness, someone else was grieving. And not just anyone. They were here, at Emily's grave. Questions rushed through his mind faster than he could contain them. Who could it be? A friend? A stranger? Someone Emily had known in secret? The unease spread through him like a cold shiver. Michael rose slowly from the ground, every sense sharpened by the sound. The muffled crying seemed to draw him in, urging him closer. His eyes searched the shadows, straining against the dim light of dusk. The roses at the grave swayed slightly in the breeze, as if pointing toward the unknown mourner. Michael's jaw tightened, his breath uneven as he braced himself, and in that charged, haunting silence, one question filled his mind. Who else could possibly be here, mourning Emily? Michael's breath hung in the cool air as he moved cautiously toward the faint sound that had shattered the silence of the graveyard. His eyes strained through the dim light until he finally caught sight of two small figures huddled at the base of Emily's headstone. At first, he thought his mind was playing tricks on him, that grief had conjured shadows into shapes. But as he stepped closer, the truth became undeniable. Two young girls knelt on the damp ground, their shoulders trembling with sobs that seemed far too heavy for children their age. One appeared to be around 9, her small frame shaking as she pressed her face into her hands. Beside her was an older girl, perhaps 12, who tried to hold herself steady but could not stop the tears slipping down her cheeks. The photograph they clutched glimmered faintly in the fading light, its edges worn and creased as if it had been cherished for years. Michael's chest tightened at the sight, his pulse racing wildly, each beat echoing louder in his ears. He froze for a moment, rooted to the spot, uncertain whether to approach or retreat. His mind scrambled for answers, none of them making sense. Who were these children and why were they here, mourning a woman they should never have known? The girls' soft cries carried in the still air, pulling at something deep inside him. He swallowed hard, his throat dry, and took a slow step forward, the crunch of gravel beneath his shoe startling the younger girl. She lifted her head abruptly, eyes red and swollen, her cheeks streaked with tears. For a moment their gazes locked, and Michael felt a jolt run through him, as though he was staring into something achingly familiar. The older girl quickly pulled the younger one close, as if to shield her from a stranger's presence. Michael raised a trembling hand slightly, a silent gesture of peace, his lips parting but no words coming out. The photograph caught his eye again. It was of Emily, smiling brightly in a moment of happiness he hadn't seen in years. The image seemed alive in their hands, and the girls clung to it as though it were their last connection to her. His breath grew shallow, his chest constricting as confusion warred with the undeniable pull of recognition. He wanted to speak, to demand answers, but his voice refused to obey. Instead, he simply stood there, watching two young strangers grieve for the woman he once called his wife. The older girl's lips trembled as she whispered something to the younger one, though Michael could not make out the words. They both turned their faces back to the gravestone, their tiny hands brushing against the marble as if reaching for comfort. Michael's heart ached, and he suddenly felt like an intruder, a trespasser on a moment too private for him to witness. Yet he could not leave. His instincts screamed at him that this was no accident, that these girls were bound to Emily in ways he could not yet grasp. He shifted uneasily, his shoes scraping against the path, drawing their attention again. This time, the older girl met his gaze directly, her eyes glistening with pain far beyond her years. Michael inhaled sharply, the air catching in his lungs, for there was something hauntingly familiar in that stare. It was not just grief he saw. It was history, a connection he could not name but felt deep in his bones. His thoughts spun out of control, racing through memories, possibilities, fears he dared not voice. The girls clung to Emily's photograph tighter, their knuckles pale against the worn paper. The silence between them stretched, thick with unspoken questions and a tension that made the world around them vanish. Michael felt his palms dampen with sweat as he wrestled with the truth pressing in on him. Why were they crying for Emily? Who had brought them here? And most haunting of all, what if they were not strangers at all? The weight of the moment bore down on him as the evening shadows deepened, leaving him with only one chilling question that refused to let go. Were these children connected to Emily's past, or to his? Michael's throat tightened as the silence between them grew unbearable, his heartbeat hammering against his chest with relentless force. The older girl's lips parted, her chin quivering as though she was gathering courage to speak a truth too heavy for her young age. Her voice, soft and trembling, finally broke the stillness. She was our mum. The words struck him low, like a thunderclap, echoing inside his skull until the world around him blurred. His knees weakened and he staggered back a step, his polished shoes scraping against the gravel. He shook his head slightly, as though trying to dislodge the words from his ears, convinced he must have misheard. But the girl's eyes, glistening with sorrow and certainty, left no room for doubt. Michael's breath came shallow, each inhale sharp and jagged, as confusion swirled violently within him. His mind leapt to the past, racing through every conversation, every letter, every distant silence between him and Emily after the divorce. She had never mentioned children, never hinted at this part of her life, and now here were two girls, living proof of a truth he had been blind to. The younger girl buried her face against her sister's arm, her small shoulders shaking, while the older one held her close, her gaze never leaving Michael's stunned expression. The photograph trembled in her grasp, the image of Emily smiling in happier days now seeming like a cruel reminder of secrets locked away. Michael pressed a hand against his temple, the weight of disbelief pressing down like iron. Questions spun wildly, each one more devastating than the last. If these girls were truly Emily's daughters, then how had he not known? How had she carried such a secret without him ever suspecting? A cold sweat broke across his brow as another thought clawed its way into his mind. If Emily was their mother, then who was their father? The possibility gripped him with icy fingers, squeezing until his chest ached. His eyes darted between the two girls, searching desperately for something familiar, something that might connect him to them. But all he saw was their grief, raw and unguarded, pouring out before the woman they called mother. His lips parted as though to speak, but no words came, only silence and the pounding rhythm of his own heart. The older girl wiped at her face with the back of her hand, her bravery fragile but undeniable. She had spoken the truth, and now the burden of it hung between them like a storm cloud ready to break. Michael's legs felt heavy, as if the ground beneath him threatened to give way. He swallowed hard, his throat dry as parchment, his mind refusing to quiet the dreadful question rising higher and higher. If Emily had daughters, if she had lived this hidden life beyond his reach, then what did that mean for him? His wealth, his reputation, his empire, all of it seemed meaningless in the face of this revelation. What mattered now was an answer, one he feared yet needed more than anything. His pulse throbbed at his temples, each beat reminding him of the uncertainty that consumed him. His gaze fell once more upon the two girls, their innocent faces streaked with tears, their small hands clutching the only memory they had of Emily. His breath caught, his body trembling as though the very air had turned against him. He wanted to run, to escape the unbearable weight of truth, but his feet refused to move. Instead, he stood there, locked in the shadow of Emily's grave, haunted by the unbearable thought. If Emily was truly their mother, Then who, in God's name, was their father? Michael stood frozen in place, his mind reeling from the weight of the words the girls had spoken, and the silence around Emily's grave seemed to close in on him like a heavy curtain, pressing down until every breath felt like a struggle against an invisible force. The older girl's trembling fingers brushed against the cold stone, her eyes never leaving the carved name, as if clinging to it was the only way she could keep her mother close. Her voice, fragile yet steady enough to pierce the quiet, slipped into the night air like a haunting confession. She whispered that Emily had raised them alone, carrying burdens no one had seen, hiding pain beneath a brave smile, and never once speaking openly about her father. Michael's heart lurched as he leaned closer, afraid to miss a single word, terrified of the truth wrapped within them. The older girl's lips quivered as she added that their mother had spoken only in fragments, never giving a name, but painting a picture of a man who valued wealth more than family, a man who had turned away from love to chase power, and Michael felt each syllable hammer against his chest like a judge delivering a sentence. His throat tightened, his stomach turned, and he staggered back a step, as though struck by a blow he hadn't seen coming, because the description she gave was too familiar, too painfully close to the man he knew himself to be. He tried to steady himself, gripping the edge of the bench near the grave, but his hand trembled violently, betraying the storm inside. The younger girl, her eyes red and wide with sorrow, lifted her face just enough to whisper that their mother had said he loved money more than her, more than them, and the innocence in her voice made the accusation all the more unbearable. Michael's knees threatened to buckle beneath the weight of guilt pressing down. The echo of Emily's old words rising like ghosts, words she had spoken when she begged him to slow down, to choose her over his relentless pursuit of success, words he had ignored until it was too late. His chest heaved as memories collided with the present, and every detail of his past decisions burned with a clarity he could no longer escape. He lifted his gaze to the two girls, searching desperately for some trace of himself in their features, some undeniable sign that would either condemn or free him. But all he saw was grief and innocence, their faces streaked with tears, their small hands clutching the faded photograph of Emily as if it were their last connection to her. Michael's mind screamed for answers, but his lips remained sealed, caught between denial and the gnawing suspicion that fate had finally come to collect what he had abandoned. He thought of Emily's quiet strength, the sacrifices she must have made to raise them without him, the nights she might have cried alone while he sat in boardrooms or flew across the world for another deal, and the shame of it all hollowed him out from the inside. The older girl met his eyes then, her gaze raw and unflinching, as if daring him to acknowledge the truth, and the weight of her stare made his pulse pound louder in his ears. Michael swallowed hard, but his throat was dry, his voice trapped somewhere between fear and longing, and every second stretched into eternity as he stood at the edge of a revelation too heavy to face. The possibility gripped him like iron chains, each link forged from regret, and he wondered if Emily had carried this secret to her grave out of love, or out of anger, or out of a desperate attempt to protect her daughters from a man who had once chosen ambition over family. His chest ached, his vision blurred, and yet he could not tear himself away from the unbearable thought forming in the deepest part of him. Were these girls truly his daughters, bound to him not only by blood, but by the betrayal that had driven Emily away? Or was destiny playing one final cruel trick that he might never unravel? The question clawed at him mercilessly, demanding an answer. And as he stood there on the edge of truth and ruin, one chilling thought refused to let him go. Were these girls really his daughters? Michael's legs finally gave out beneath the crushing weight of truth, and he dropped to his knees in the damp grass, the roses slipping from his hand and scattering against the ground like fallen fragments of his heart, his polished image stripped away until all that remained was a man trembling in the shadow of his past. His voice cracked as he forced the words out, each syllable drenched in fear and longing, a confession he had never thought he would make. "I think I might be your father," he whispered, his chest heaving as though every breath weighed. as fighting against years of silence. The air seemed to freeze, and for a moment the world held its breath with them, the headstone standing solemnly between revelation and denial. The older girl's lips parted in shock, her wide eyes flickering with disbelief, while the younger one recoiled instantly, her face twisting with raw anguish as she shook her head violently. "No!" she cried, her small fists clenching, her voice shrill with pain that echoed through the graveyard like a wounded bird. "Our dad abandoned us!" The words tore into Michael with the precision of a blade, slicing deeper than any insult or judgment he had ever faced in his life, leaving him gasping for air. Her tears streamed down her cheeks as she clung to her sister, burying her grief in the only safety she knew. And Michael's heart cracked at the sight of her fragile body, shaking under the weight of betrayal she believed was his. He reached a trembling hand toward them, but stopped midway, his courage faltering under the fear in their eyes, their distrust heavy enough to crush whatever hope lingered inside him. His knees pressed harder into the earth, his expensive suit no shield against the cold reality that he may have lost them before he ever had the chance to know them. The older girl remained silent, her expression torn between shock, anger, and something softer that she refused to show, while the younger one's sobs rang louder, each one an accusation that echoed in Michael's chest. He lowered his head, his body trembling as years of regret spilled out through his silence, the empire he had built feeling like dust compared to the possibility of losing them forever. His voice wavered as he tried to speak again, but the words caught in his throat, and all he could manage was a broken whisper of apology carried away by the night air. Every choice he had made, every sacrifice he had justified in tea. The name of success now stood before him in the form of two girls who saw him as nothing more than the shadow of a man who had walked away. His heart throbbed with a desperate longing to be believed, to be forgiven, but their tears reminded him that forgiveness was not something he could demand, only something they might one day give. The older girl finally met his eyes, her stare piercing and unyielding, as though weighing his soul against the memory of their mother's words, and Michael felt the weight of her judgment pressing harder than any jury could have. His breath came shallow, his lips dry, and he knew this moment would decide everything, whether he would be given a chance to prove himself or be cast out of their lives forever. The night grew colder, the wind whispering through the trees like voices of the past, and Michael remained on his knees, waiting, praying for even the faintest sign that hope still lived in their hearts. Yet as the younger girl's cries grew louder and the older girl's silence stretched into something unbearable, the question clawed at him with merciless persistence. Would these girls believe him, or would they reject him forever? Michael remained on his knees, his body trembling from the storm of emotions tearing him apart. His eyes red and swollen as tears streamed freely down his face, soaking into the earth beneath him, his strength stripped bare until nothing remained but raw desperation. The silence between him and the girls stretched like an unbridgeable gulf, broken only by the sound of their soft sobs and the quiet rustle of the wind through the trees. For the first time in his life, the man who had once commanded boardrooms, who had been feared and respected in circles of power, found himself powerless before the fragile judgment of two young hearts. His lips quivered as he begged, the words tumbling out without pride, without restraint, his voice breaking into pieces. He pleaded for forgiveness, for a chance to right what he could no longer undo, his confessions spills, ling into the cold night air like prayers at a broken altar. The younger girl turned her face away, her small frame stiff with distrust, her arms clinging desperately to her sister, as if afraid he might vanish if she let go, while the older one's gaze lingered on him, her eyes searching his face with an intensity that pierced through his soul. She hesitated, torn between the stories her mother had left behind and the fragile man kneeling before her now, a man who seemed stripped of wealth and pride, left only with sorrow and longing. Finally, after what felt like eternity, Her lips parted, her voice trembling but steady enough to carry across the cold air. "If you're really our dad," she whispered, her words slow, deliberate, heavy with the weight of trust hanging by a thread, "then prove you won't leave us again." Michael's heart lurched at her plea, a rush of pain and hope colliding in his chest as he lifted his head, his eyes locking with hers, his tears shining with sincerity. He reached out, this time not with hesitation but with a desperate determination, his arms wrapping around them as though he could shield them from every wound the world had inflicted. At first, the younger one resisted, her body stiff with fear and anger, but the warmth of his embrace, the sincerity in his trembling voice as he vowed never to walk away again, began to soften the walls she had built. She buried her face against his chest, her sobs muffled by the beating of his heart, while her sister, older and stronger, clung to him with a fragile hope that perhaps, just perhaps, they had found the father they had been searching for all along. Michael wept openly, the weight of years crashing down as he held them, the scent of roses and earth filling his senses, the gravestone beside them a solemn witness to the fragile reunion. In that sacred moment, surrounded by shadows of grief and whispers of the past, three broken hearts found each other, binding themselves in a vow forged not by blood alone, but by the courage to forgive and the hunger to belong. Michael pressed his forehead against the top of their heads, whispering promises over and over, swearing that no amount of wealth or power could ever tempt him to abandon them again. That from this moment forward, they were his true legacy, his only treasure worth protecting. The night seemed to still, the moonlight bathing them in silver, as though Emily herself were watching, her spirit finally at peace, knowing that love had found its way back into the lives she left behind. The roses at her grave glistened with dew, a silent reminder of her sacrifices, her love, her hope that even in death she might guide him back to what truly mattered. Michael closed his eyes, inhaling the fragile warmth of his daughters against him, and for the first time in years he felt whole, not as a man defined by success, but as a father defined by love. And there at Emily's grave, with tears and promises sealing their bond, a man who once thought wealth was everything discovered that love, lost and found, was his true fortune.